if you've watched part one, which you might have done, you might not have done, part two is kind of a revisit, if you like, but we've tried to sort of take this and break it down a little bit more. The technique that I'm using is predominantly dry brushing, and the idea with dry brushing is that you get a little bit of paint on your brush and then you will pretty much wipe most of that off. And it's surprising how much paint can be retained on a brush even when you've wiped it in a bit of kitchen roll or paper towel or whatever. But you're building up in small pieces. Now the first section, when we're putting on sort of the bulk of the grey onto the wall, that's fairly thick. There's a fair dollop of paint on there. But as we start going over the rocks, we're taking that paint and we're actually wiping it on the sort of the base of the model, on the sort of flat bit. That's just to take the paint off, because each brush stroke we're seeing very quickly how much paint's on there, and you'll kind of know when you're dry brushing, you're looking for little build-ups at a time, and it's better to do it slowly and gradually, a little bit at a time, and you've more control over the overall effect. The paints that we've thrown out onto the table to use are a dark grey, a medium grey and a light grey. I've got a couple of extra light greys tucked in behind this time as well, a couple of different shades, but again there's a dark, medium and light in that too. An army painter and two game colours. I've got an off-white again, the Corax white, and I've got the texture paint, I've got a blue, and then I've got a couple of washes tucked up there too, but we'll not worry about them just yet. So on the undercoated model, working the grey into it, large sections are getting a fairly heavy coating of it, and then the rock sections get an increasingly very dry brush of grey to try and pick out the details, heavy on the flats and lighter around the rubble, so it kind of gives a bit of variation to it. And you'll sort of see me constantly working away to the tissue to wipe the brush, clean it off before we would move on to another colour. Once I've got that first coat of grey on, then I'm going back as we did in the first video, and I'm using that contrast paint to pick out the dark sort of clefts in the rock, the big cracks in the wall, any of the sort of shadowy areas or large pools of what should be shadow in my head in the rubble at the base of the wall as well. What's probably not coming across here, and it's worth mentioning, I think I mentioned it in a later part anyway, is that obviously this is like a 4-part kit, and if you're working on terrain and it's multiple pieces, separate pieces like this scatter terrain, it's probably a good idea to do all the colour of a certain type at the one time, and that way as you're mixing the colour on your palette, you're kind of using that up and you're being more consistent across the terrain too. It's not a thing that always annoys me, and it doesn't annoy all sort of gamers either, because quite often you don't mind a little bit of variation. Buildings aren't uniform, even rubble and ruins don't tend to all be exactly the same, so little variations are kind of natural and real. But by the same token, on the tabletop sometimes that can look a little bit off-putting, and it can look a little bit too haphazard. It's down to yourself to sort of decide that. Quite heavy with the contrast wash around sort of the base areas of the rocks around the ruin, and that sort of stuff, it's worth bearing in mind, does take a little bit longer to dry. The more paint you're using, the bigger areas you're covering. Obviously it is going to take a bit longer to dry, so do give yourself time to let that happen. And if you're working on multiple pieces, that kind of means that you can swap them around, and then while something else is drying, you're working on the next piece anyway. So the first grey is dry, the contrast paint still a bit wet at the minute, but the bits that I'm going to work on, it shouldn't matter too much. I really only want that contrast paint to kind of go into the cracks and nooks and crannies, but I'm also aware that the contrast paint itself is like a dark grey. So I know that anything light that it mixes with, it's going to kind of mix up and it's going to give me another shade of grey as well. So here we go, starting to pick out the edges. And again, reasonably heavy handed. One of the things you'll sort of start to see when you're painting buildings and things like that too is the colours tend to dry out a little bit duller than they first appear. Now, not always a huge amount, don't go sort of crazy on it, but it looks like quite a stark difference there. But obviously, I'm intending doing more work to the walls as well. So your edges, fresh cuts in the stone, they tend to be brighter and cleaner than the face of the wall and things like that there. They're getting hit by the rain more often. If bits get knocked off, chipped off, they're always slightly cleaner as the fresh stonework is exposed. And that's kind of true for everything, be it metal work or whatever. So if you're working in metal colours and you wanted to sort of show a fresh hole or tear in the metal, you might have the edges of that cut brighter than the surrounding metalwork to try and sort of emphasise that too. But as you can see, fairly footloose and fancy free with the application of this highlight and dry brush. And it's just again over all the sort of exposed areas, bar the flat pieces. This is all for sort of edges of the chunks and crevices and any of the edges of the cuts into the stone wall too. I'm kind of doing this to buy a bit of time whilst some of that contrast paint is drying for me at the minute. So starting to work a grey now into the face of the walls, wanting to show it slightly weathered. I've got the brush kind of straggly so that I can kind of get like scrape marks, almost striations into the face of it, and I'm kind of going at different angles, sort of cutting down, almost as if it's cutting down into the rock a little bit or onto the face of the stone. It's, to be honest, just sort of trial and error. It's a little bit of hit and miss. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you have to kind of go over it again. It depends as well what effect you're wanting. I'm obviously wanting quite a worn down, worn, old looking piece of concrete that's been sort of sitting, it's been exposed to the rain and the wind and all sorts of things. So again, maybe a little bit heavier handed in this one than you might want if it's a new building or even if it's a more medieval sort of ruin. I'm kind of trying to suggest more battle damage, I suppose, as well than anything else. But again, just fairly easy going with it. And I'd love to say there's some sort of rhyme or reason to what I'm doing here, but there probably isn't. By that stage, I'm probably just kind of lost in thought. If you're wondering why I wasn't sort of chatting at the time we were actually filming this, so there was too much background noise, tractors and things outside. It was just impossible. Couldn't hear a word. I could barely even think. So with that done, it was at this point I think, yep, I'm working in the blue. So again, the blue from the first video, this is a different wall section, by the way. So I'm working that blue in for the internal part of the wall. In this case, I just had gone for blue and I just decided this part of the wall was internal. There was nothing to sort of be specially meaningful about that. But I just decided to try and unify the four pieces of this particular kit so that they could represent one large ruin, or quite happily spread them around the battlefield with other damaged buildings, and it wouldn't look too out of place having a splash of colour on the wall here. And that is just very lightly being dabbed down. It's a very sort of watered down colour to begin with, quite pale towards the top, and then working a darker, slightly darker layer of it down towards the bottom of the edges, so that some parts kind of look fairly intact and other bits look as if they've been kind of washed out, worn away, or just sort of gone, really. Once this blue is on and dry, I'll be mixing up another sort of, not quite the base colour, but the base and a little bit of the Corax white so that I can sort of again very, very lightly and with several goes dry brush over the top edges of this to again soften down the blue so it's just not so intense and doesn't look kind of fresh too much. Throwing on some textured paint. Textured paint's an oddity. It's not a thing I would use very often. Basically, it's paint with sand in it, very, very fine grain sand. It is possible to make your own. You can take a small quantity of fine sand, mix it with, well, you've got a couple of choices. You can mix it with PVA glue and paint that onto the base of whatever you're doing or onto the walls if you want a more textured wall. And then when that's completely dry, you can overpaint that and you'll have this kind of rough feeling base to it. You can buy textured paints as well. Tends to be greys and browns and blacks, things like that there. And you can also take a quantity of paint and mix sand with it. Can be a little bit hard to work with, but you know, it's an easy option if you've got sand and you've got enough paint. You can have a go at doing that yourself. Oddly enough, throwing paint down and sprinkling sand on it doesn't work very well at all. Um, but again, throwing the textured sand out because this base on this particularly is sort of scrap. You can't cut it away and just keep the ruin. But I decided in all these pieces to keep the flat piece, bring it into being part of the model itself, and then when there's miniatures on the table, if they're on stepping or standing on that flat area, I can consider that they're in part of that cover and getting the benefit of being in cover and things like that there. So there's a gaming rationale for keeping that with it, and it's saving out basing them. Um, the buildings will all be based, so it kind of looks good in that regard. That textured grey, what was left of it, I also dabbed on the outer walls in some parts and sort of just touched them up. Um, Again, it was just a go at it. It was a little experiment. There was no particular reason for doing it. The grey on the walls wasn't too bad, and then I sort of thought, well, maybe it gives the impression that I don't know, like pebble dashed or just the concrete's kind of roughened up a little bit. Not heavy, not a big go at all. Almost a dry brushing of it, which with texture paint is not easy anyway. But just sort of have a crack at it. The base was quite sort of monotone, and I always find that like concrete pavements or roads and things like that have a bit of variation to them. So again, taking a couple of the greys or one of the greys and a little bit of the white or a lighter grey and mixing them together and then sort of stippling that base. And by stippling just means sort of the brush was dipped into a colour and then almost sort of stabbed onto the base and just kept working it, almost rotating the brush to try and not have it looking like brush strokes or just drops of paint. Sort of stab it down onto the base and work it around with lighter edges coming in towards then the darker marking around the actual base of the wall itself. Again, just like shadows or where dirt and debris has gathered up. And I'm looking at what I'm doing at the minute, and that's not what I'm actually talking about. And I kind of don't know what he's doing. I don't know what he's painting there at the minute. I think he's again applying a little bit of it is me by the way, but you know it's at a different time, so I can talk about me in the third person. Yeah, I'm just again adding a few more striations to the wall there. I decided that it wasn't quite blended in enough with that worn down effect on the blue. It looks quite stark there, the difference looking at it on the picture myself, and in reality it's not. When the colour's fresh, as I say, it can look quite vibrant and bright, but when it dries, it does tend to be quite a bit of dulling down in that too. And I think the camera's added a little bit of artificial illumination to it too. There we go. There's where I was talking about the base. So I've brought out the other piece that was already done. And now, side by side, I'm trying to blend in the base on the new piece to be a little bit closer to the first one. As I say, the texture paint that has been applied has already dried, and that's me just sort of stippling on a slightly lighter grey. I'll do that a couple of times, working a lighter grey round the edges and in towards the centre, but not quite to the base of the wall. And I'll probably add an even lighter grey again. And again, these will, if you haven't been too heavy handed with it, they will darken down slightly. But the main thing is, and you can see there, those sort of stipple marks. The main thing I find, for me anyway, is to work those and work those until they're not just as pronounced, until the colour all sort of blends in a little bit more smoothly. And I think it looks a little bit more natural then, like the variations you get in paving slabs or whatever. And there's the opportunity then, if you think you're sort of working the bases and there's still a bit of a difference, you can always work on a previous one again to help the colour that you've just mixed up merge the two of them a little bit more. And if you're working on multiple pieces and you have that colour ready, you can again go back and revisit other pieces you've already done to try and blend them all in and just make them a little bit more harmonious with each other. And there now we can see the three sections that were worked on sort of sitting side by side. You can see that there is a bit of a difference obviously in the larger piece's base. It hasn't been worked just as pale as the smaller two. We can address that, or it can be left as I say because they're separate, but because the colour's mixed up, it's just as easy to have it sitting there beside the other two and start working some of that colour that was mixed for the other one's base into that one. And that then again, as I say, helps just unite them as looking as they're all sort of part of the one building. And that's pretty much it. The three pieces done. And again, quite happy. You could let that go, get them onto the table, start gaming. Nothing to stop it. But there are other little things we can do, and we can look at those in part 3.